I'm going to play rather fast and loose with chronology, as you will see this evening. And certainly I'm going to play fast and loose with the term Anglo-Saxon, because I'm going to interpret it as running up to the end of the 12th century. Now, this is not because I'm unaware that that's how it's not usually used in those terms, but rather because the period, as I will argue, the period up to the end of the 12th century in many ways forms a unity. It forms a unity marked by a fundamental change in building techniques. Now that argument is not itself a novel conclusion. Indeed, it was first proposed over 20 years ago, and evidence to support a fundamental change at the end of the 12th century in timber buildings has been accumulating ever since. However, what I want to suggest in the first part of my paper is that we can actually identify a tradition, although I'm going to be very cautious about the use of the word tradition, a practice perhaps extending back right into the early part of the Anglo-Saxon period. So we've got a practice which extends for 700 years or so, and I will refer to this as an early medieval tradition, although, as you will see, I want to be rather cautious about the use of the word tradition. The second element which I want to put forward is that the types of the buildings which I will be discussing is only one of a number of types of construction. There are other types of buildings which are less well attested and indeed were probably less common. Some of them are likely to have been restricted only to parts of the country, although it's difficult to demonstrate this because the evidence is too slight. And many of these types appear to have faded away over time, and they're certainly not well represented in the archaeology. So we should probably not be talking about a tradition, but traditions of building. And finally, I want to think about the processes of how you put up a building. How do you set about constructing a building with heavy timber posts? And I think that in a number of structures we can achieve a fair understanding of the way the building was planned and erected. And if we can work that out, I think it tells us a considerable amount about the nature of the building. So that's my agenda for this evening. Now, the fundamental problem is, of course, as we move back in time from, let us say, the 15th century, we find progressively fewer and fewer standing timber buildings. And by the time we reach the start of the 12th century, the number of timber buildings which survive are reduced to really only a few fragmentary remains. Before 1150, there is only one timber structure known, the church here at Greenstead in Essex, constructed around about 1080, according to the dendrochronological dates. Well, we ought to treat this building with suspicion, or at least, if not suspicion, then caution, because I think in archaeology we know to treat exceptional survivals as not typical, but as exceptional. And therefore, we should be doubtful whether this represents typical buildings of the end of the 11th century or something rather unusual. It is constructed, as you can see, of close-set timbers or staves, a method of building which is attested in very few other buildings. So, I'm going to regard Greenstead not as a signpost to the form of other early buildings, but regard it as unusual, as an example of one of the lesser traditions of construction which I'll discuss. So what are the materials which we can actually use to interpret the form of earlier buildings? And I think these fall into three categories. First of all, and rather importantly, we have a certain number of roofs which survive on stone buildings. They survive on stone buildings because, of course, the timber buildings don't survive. And we are fortunate that these have recently been reviewed in an article by Lynn Courtney and Nat Alcock, who looked at the evidence from across northwest Europe and identified a remarkable 281 roofs of the 11th and 12th century. and they were able to construct a typology and identify their key features. Now, the important thing that concerns us is that all the 11th century examples which they identified, and I put up some 11th and 12th century examples, all the 11th century and early 12th century examples that they identified had common tie beams. So here is the tie beam, and you can see all of the examples have tie beams running across between the two rafters at wall plate level. Now, from the later part, second half of the 12th century, this becomes slightly unusual, and the tie beams occur only on every second or third truss. But I think we can say that probably in the 11th century, the normal way of building was to use tie beams to unite the two rafters. This was the way. This is what we should probably expect to find on timber as well as masonry buildings. Well, I wanted to turn to one example in particular, an example which no longer survives, Adel Parish Church near Leeds, probably to be dated to about 1160, but we have, the building doesn't survive, so there's no opportunity, or sorry, the roof doesn't survive, so we have no opportunity to get a dendro date. But to judge from the stone fabric, it was probably the original building and the original roof, and the church itself we can date on art historical grounds to about 1160. Now, what is interesting is, of course, that we have a roof of the type we've already seen with tie beams, and rather interestingly, it also has this, in each of the walls it has this timber, you can see it there, and you can see it there, which J.T. Smith has called a locking beam. I think a locking plate would probably be more correct, but he calls it a locking beam, and the idea is to keep the timber trusses vertical, to stop them from racking or falling over to one side or another. And he went on and identified in the lower part of this slide, he identified other examples in Sweden and in Denmark. And indeed, one of our problems in trying to understand these early buildings is to try and think about how they actually worked as structures, how they didn't fall over before the use of purlins. And I think we have some clear examples, clear evidence here. Now, how far we can project backwards from the 12th century back into the 11th and 10th century, this sort of roof is questionable. What we can say is that certainly by the 12th century, the other examples that we've got at the chapel at Harlowbury and at the church at Kempley, they use a slightly different system because they are using the feet of the rafters and they're mortaring them into the stone walls. So that doesn't provide a very useful indication of how such a roof would have actually worked on timber buildings. But I think this gives us a hint of the sorts of things we might expect on timber buildings. What else can we say about them? Well, the next, I think, important factor which we can say is something about the spacing of these roofs. They are what's called common rafter roofs. I'll explain the term later, but basically each rafter truss, each rafter pair and tie beam are the same. It's not that some are bigger and some are smaller, they are the same. And they are remarkably closely spaced. So here are some figures largely taken from Lynn Courtney and Nat Alcock's paper with, I think, a few additions by myself. And you can see the sorts of spacing. This is from centre to centre, so about between half a metre and 0.7 metres. These are quite closely spaced rafter pairs. So I think we've got a hint here of the sort of thing which we might expect on timber buildings. There is no reason to think that this sort of roof would not have sat on timber buildings. So that's our first strand of evidence. What else can we use? Well, the next strand, of course, is the excavated timbers from waterlogged sites, because it's only on waterlogged sites that we're actually going to get the timbers surviving. This is problematic. It poses all sorts of problems, and over the last few months I've been struggling to work out how quite we can interpret them. One of the problems that we've got is that very rarely do we find building timbers in situ. We often find them reused, house timbers reused. Alternatively, we find them, as in this case, in not a surface-built building, but in the cellar of a building. This is Coppergate, a mid-10th century building, and what we're looking at is the base of the cellar. It was partly subterranean building. And of course, a building which is set partly below ground has particular functions to perform. It's got to act as to retain the soil either side. So we can't just imagine something similar placed at ground level. Alternatively, they have been found in waterfront conditions. Again, slightly different situation. They've been found in watermills. Again, another slightly different situation, because watermills are exposed to particular pressures or forces of making the watermill actually work. So the evidence from waterlogged timbers is interesting, it's very important, but it is by no means simple to interpret. Its interpretation, indeed, has been particularly complicated, and these timbers, published a number of years ago, well, you can see in 1992, published a number of years ago, coming from Billingsgate Lorry Park, were initially interpreted as the timbers from the sill, from the ground sill of a building, and only subsequently were they reinterpreted as the wall plate. In other words, they didn't come at the bottom of the wall, they came at the top of the wall. And the problem for the problem in interpretation was because these timbers were not found in situ, they were found in reused contexts. Now, the interesting thing here, which we can pick out, is that they've got mortises there which are very closely set, and that makes us think back to those closely set rafter pairs and beams which we saw in the stone building. But I'll come back to that point later on. In this particular case, they're set at intervals of about 0.6 metres. At Cheapside, the timbers had mortises set 0.8 metres. So clearly we're in the same sort of area of those rafters. So we can perhaps imagine some timber posts rising up through those wall plates, and on each of the posts was set a rafter couple and its beam. Now, the problematic element of the evidence, not only from London but also from York, is that it is not simply one type of building which is found, but a whole variety of buildings which have been found. And we are left wondering, as indeed the excavators were left wondering, why there were so many traditions of construction. So you can see here in the top two, in the top line on the left and the centre left, you can see stave-built buildings with vertically set timbers, and then at the end of the top line you can see a wattle wall supporting a turf-built wall with an inner aisle post. And this was one of the bits of evidence recently published in Archaeological Journal, indeed, which comes from the London excavations. And this particular bit of evidence has illuminated a building which was published a number of years ago at Waltham Abbey by Peter Huggins. And Peter Huggins published this and suggested this was the building he had dug up at Waltham Abbey was a Viking hall, which produced a very sharp riposte and a refutation indeed by Peter Huggins himself. But we can now see actually that the Waltham Abbey Hall fits into the broader London evidence. It's quite clear that it is the type of building which was excavated at Waltham Abbey was very much like that example of the wattled wall, which you can see number C, with the aisle post and the timber, and the turf walls. It fits in absolutely to that category. So we struggle slightly to work out exactly what's going on, and the London evidence has perhaps opened our eyes to the breadth of types of building which there may be, and I'll come back to this point later on. Now, my third type of evidence which we can use is from dryland sites. And the evidence here is not as difficult as is sometimes portrayed, because often we are able to use, although the timbers don't survive because it's a dry site, the evidence for the timbers and for their scantling, their shape and their size does survive. It survives as what is quaintly called post-ghosts, dark patches where the timbers actually were. So in the left-hand diagram, you're looking down on top of a post hole, and that dark bit towards the top of the post hole is where the timber was, and you can see it has been packed around very neatly with little stones which have been packed in there to keep that post upright. One thing I would draw your attention to is that that post hole has been very carefully cut. It's not an irregular shape. It is in fact slightly larger and of the same shape as the timber post that went in it. So there is a care in the construction of this building, a point that I'll come back to. The second example was when we were working at Gabor Thomas's site at Bishopston in Sussex, and we walked past a trench which had been cleared out, and noticed in the side that that trench had cut through a wall, and there in the dark area was in fact another post ghost. And there you can see the dark of the timber set hard against the edge of the trench of the building. And in both these cases, those timbers were set with the inside edge aligned closely to the post hole in one case and the post trench in the other case. So we can go quite far in talking about posts, even though the timbers don't actually survive. Here's my own excavation some years ago at Stenning. This is a doorway of a building. We can tell from this fairly confidently where the door was hinged. It was hinged with the hinges on the left-hand side. How do I know that? Well, it's the larger, quite clearly is the larger post. Those are very carefully cut posts, post holes, I should say. And although the post ghosts in that case didn't survive, those post holes were almost certainly cut for the timbers, precisely for the timbers that were intended to fit in there. And so we've got some indication of what sort of size they are, what sort of shape they are. So a doorway probably hinged on the left-hand side where the larger post would have stood. Now, as you will have gathered from what I have said, we are actually dealing with different sorts of evidence on dryland sites. And there are two different practices. The one which involves cutting individual post holes in which the timbers were set. The other, on the right-hand side from Monkton in Kent, involves cutting trenches in which the timbers are set. And a lot of things have been said about these post-in-trench building, including the suggestion that you actually put a sill beam at the bottom of those trenches and then set your posts in it. Well, there is no evidence for that whatsoever. What is quite clear, I think, and it's evident on many buildings, is that the posts were set at intervals along that post trench. There were gaps between the posts that were set. And I would again draw your attention to the fact that if you could look at the edges of the trench, the edges of the trench again was most nearly vertical on the inner side, and I'll give you a further example of this later on, because it's the inner side which is the point the point where they are concerned to align the timbers. So we've got two different types, and we had a project some years ago in which we accumulated a huge database of buildings from 900 to 1200, and we did all sorts of interesting things with them. And one of them was to look at which was more common, whether post-hole buildings were more common or post-and-trench buildings were more common. And as you can see, they sort of level peg till about 1100, and then post-and-trench become less common, and post-hole buildings, set in individual post holes, become more common. And one of the reasons may be what is shown on the lower graph, because in the lower graph we looked at the spacing of those timbers, where we could actually identify the timbers themselves, even if it was from post-ghosts. And you can see that they get progressively larger, so that by the beginning of the 12th century, they're really quite widely spaced, which came as somewhat of a surprise to us. Now, the numbers, the data on which this is based is quite shallow, but it seems that as they put the posts further and further apart, they thought, why are we bothering to cut the trench right the way along when we've got posts at intervals? We might as well cut post holes for the individual posts. All right, well, I've moved from the Anglo-Saxon period to a building of the 15th century because it's simply convenient to illustrate the point which I want to make, and that is about the forms of construction. And the point is that in the later Middle Ages we have a quite different method of building, a method of building which involves principal posts, in other words large posts which gather together the weight of the roof and convey them to the ground. We have principal rafters which do the same thing, it gathers together the weight of the roof, helps to secure the roof so that it doesn't rock or rack from side to side. And in between the principal posts we have smaller timbers whose role is not to take the weight of the roof but to simply hold the wall in position, and these are known as studs. So I've coloured in the principal posts in brown, I've coloured in the principal rafters in brown and the beams connecting them, and you can see it divides the building up into bays, into separate sections. Now, from what I've already said, this tradition is something which is not found in this long Anglo-Saxon period which I've described. Instead, we have posts, each of which seem to be of similar, not identical, but of similar size. In other words, we don't have principal posts and studs, which is the later medieval practice. We have common posts, posts of similar size, and common rafters, again, the rafters being of similar size. So something really rather different happening, a change taking place around 1200 or so. So if we had posts of a similar size set close to, what occupied the gaps in between? Well, the short answer is we're not terribly clear, but we have one fragment of evidence, and that is from Ancient Abbey. And at Ancient Abbey, the wall had fallen over, the wall of the 10th century building had fallen over, and the daub had survived. The daub had been covered partly with lime wash, it had survived, and at that point they were able to examine the daub. The timbers themselves had rotted away, and what we were left with is the clay daub in between, and from this it was possible to reconstruct what you can see on the top right, a wall with timbers, probably not set in fact in a sole plate as shown there, but a wall with timbers, and in between some sort of wattle work which was attested in the daub, and filling in the gaps in the building. So a lot of close set posts with daub in between. So this is what I think we should probably imagine our typical Anglo-Saxon building to look like. Not like the Stave Church Greenstead with the timbers contiguous, but rather something like this with close set timbers and panels of daub in between. Well, I want now to push the argument a little bit further forward, and I want to take one particular building. And I'm taking this building because it's very instructive, and I think it shows what you can do when you start thinking in detail about one building and what the implications of the evidence is. It's a building at Springfield Lions in Essex. It's one of a number of similar buildings which consists of two cells, two parts. What is probably the hall, which is to the right, and the smaller chamber to the left. What makes this building slightly different is that at the bottom of the slide you can see that there's a rather irregular line of post holes, and they are irregular. They don't seem. It's very difficult to imagine a wall going in between those post holes, and I don't think they probably did serve that purpose. I think that they were probably raking timbers which were put in as the building began to fall over, as it began to rack to one side, as the timber bases rotted, and they were put in to support either the tops of the timber or the wall plate running between them. On the top of the main part of the building you can see the other wall in plan. This was badly ploughed out. We're looking here below ground level, we're looking at the post holes that survive, and ploughing had reduced the post holes to just the larger post holes. So let's look and see what we can do. We can take those raking posts on the bottom wall, on the lower wall, southern wall, and we can show that they pair rather nicely with posts in the wall itself, and we can then suggest that they actually then were joined up probably by rafter couples, rafter pairs and a beam to similar posts on the other side. So we can put them in really rather neatly and suggest that actually they work rather well. And this is not unusual to Springfield Lions. It is absolutely typical that almost invariably buildings of this period have paired posts which are paired across their width. Now, you may think that I'm playing slightly fast and loose with the evidence because I have omitted the timbers in between, the ones which I haven't coloured in red. But you'll see that they tend to be slightly smaller post holes, and therefore implying, in my argument, slightly smaller timbers. And I would suggest that what we're getting is the emergence of posts which carry the weight and studs which do not. That we're moving towards this practice, moving away from posts which are solidly weight supporting to having weight supporting timbers and smaller timbers in between whose sole purpose is to support the wall itself, to hold up the wall with the daub and wattle panels such as we saw previously. And indeed we probably, if it had not been so heavily ploughed on the upper side of that, on the north side of that building, we'd have probably seen something similar there. And the fact that what survives is those post holes implies that the studs, the smaller post holes, were shallow. They had not survived the process of ploughing. So the first point we can make is that we're beginning, certainly towards the end of this long Anglo-Saxon period, we're beginning to get the emergence of a distinction between posts, weight-bearing posts, and studs, whose purpose is to hold up the wall. The second point which I'd like to draw your attention to is the end walls. And the end walls are problematic. They lack any clear corner post. And archaeologists have observed this phenomenon in many, many buildings, and they refer to it very inaccurately as weak corners, that there's not a proper corner post. There's an angled corner post. There are posts which run up to the corner but never actually reach it. And I think you can see that. There. And certainly we'll see other examples of it. The third thing which I would like to draw your attention to is that the walls aren't actually straight. You cannot draw a straight line along those walls, what you end up with is a building which comes in, is pinched in, if you like, at the two ends. Now, I'm going to argue that buildings were laid out with considerable care, and therefore this is not an error, this is not a mistake, that this is in fact a recurrent feature. And in fact, we can see this tendency to bring in the end walls, to narrow the building at the end in a number of structures. And the final thing that I just want to draw your attention to before I go on is the way the doorway is accommodated. The doorway is accommodated by setting those doorposts slightly further apart on the southern side and changing the angle of the beams of the rafter couples. They all clearly had no problem with that, so they didn't have to be perfectly parallel. Okay, so what is the implication of these pinched-in buildings? Well, here's another example. This is a building at Bicester, and it's same sort of thing. In this case, the walls are angled. It's not pinched in so much as the walls are not set in a straight line at all, and the angle changes at the doorway. And I've referred to these in the past as angle-sided buildings. They're not curved buildings. They are two, sometimes three different alignments. What's the implication of this? Well, if you have a building which is wider in the middle and narrower at the ends, you can do two things. You can either, when you're putting a roof on it, you can either lower the pitch of the roof in the middle, so it sort of bows down, or you can raise up the ridge of the roof in the centre. And by far the most likely option is that the ridge of the roof would have risen up in the centre, because otherwise you're going to channel the water down towards the centre of the building, indeed precisely where you've got your doorway. So you'll get the heaviest runoff exactly over the doorway, surely an undesirable thing to happen. So we can imagine that the profile of the building is something like this. I say something like this because I've chosen in many ways, extreme parallel. Extreme because it's much earlier, extreme because it's a huge building at Gamla Lera in Denmark, and extreme because it is, of course, a Danish building. But I've used it simply to show how, certainly on the continent, they had, well, that's our interpretation, they had buildings which apparently had these ridge lines that rise up towards the middle. Now, the big difference between the buildings I've been talking about and the continental so-called boat-shaped buildings is that they are actually in a continuous curve in the continent. The English ones, none of them have a curve. They have angles. They have different angles, but a series of straight alignments. Well, I want to come and just pursue this idea a little bit further, this idea of the so-called weak corners. I think it's a terrible term, but since it seems to have become embedded, it's difficult to know how quite to get rid of it and avoid it. And I've picked an example, I've picked quite deliberately an example which comes from the earliest part of our period, the excavation at Mucking from the 5th to 6th century phase at Mucking. And here is one particular building. We don't know, we've got post holes, but we've got no evidence of post ghosts. We don't know exactly how the timbers would have fitted in, but we can more or less work out the alignment of the walls. And the thing which I think is clear is, it emerges very clearly there, is that there is no corner posts. So something's happening at the corners, something is clearly different. The other feature which I'll draw your attention to is that the end walls in these particular buildings are as substantially built as the side walls. The end walls, of course, don't have to take the weight of the roof, but the side walls do. So I think that's interesting, and I think that it has all sorts of implications. And I would suggest that the profile, if you were going to try and put a roof on a building such as that building at Mucking, the profile of it is probably going to look something like the building which I've drawn on the right-hand side, it's going to have a sort of chamfered corner, or angled-in corner. And I've suggested how it might be built in the other diagram. I think they must use timbers which run across between the wall plates. Dragon ties is the proper term. Dragon ties which link up those two walls. Now, the diagram on the left-hand side is slightly misleading because I've shown it with a filled-in wall trench rather than individual post holes, but that's really not important. It's the general picture which is important. The other point which I'll draw your attention to is that it seems to me that if you've got these chamfered corners, angled-in corners, or weak corners as they're referred to, then the implication is that you haven't got a gabled end. It seems to me most likely you've got some sort of hipped end. And I say this because there seems to be a fascination and an obsession by people reconstructing timber buildings to always put Anglo-Saxon buildings with gabled ends rather than hipped ends, and I think that there's no justification. In this case, I can't see how you get a hipped end very easily onto a building like that. I think a gable end onto it. I think it must be hipped. Now, let's just think about the implications of what I have shown, because I'll just go back for a second. The implications, it seems to me, from looking at mucking building and from looking at many other buildings, is that the walls are erected in a series of sections, the end walls, and, as I will show, the side walls. They're erected in a series of sections and then joined together. That's what those dragon ties, those chamfered corners, do. Dragon ties being timbers there and there. That's what they do. They join together these sections. And when we begin to look at buildings, we can see that there's in fact quite good evidence that the walls are in fact built in sections. So here we are in the 7th century, and Cowder is down. As you can see, a post and trench building. We've got post ghosts. We can do all sorts of things with this building. But in fact, we've got, if you draw lines through those post ghosts, you get a series of alignments. And something like this. So the long walls have 4 alignments, and the end walls have 2 alignments. And I would suggest the way this building has been put up is by setting a series of posts in the ground, and once they're in the ground, you set a wall plate on top of them, and then you continue and work your way along the wall, set another section of wall in, set a wall plate on top, and then probably link together those wall plates to give it some structural stability. So here we are, I've drawn a diagram just illustrating the different lengths, as you've seen, of those wall panels or wall sections. And when one looks in detail at the Cowders Down evidence, it's fairly clear that that's what must have happened, and we can demonstrate it not only at Cowders Down, we can demonstrate it in a number of buildings where the wall sections don't always align perfectly. Here we are at Cheddar, the Royal Palace site. Here we've got the Long Hall. It's a very complicated building. There's lots of problems about in its interpretation, including, as you can see on the upper side, two sets of post holes running next to each other. But the point I would draw your attention to is, first of all, the weak corners, that we've got separate wall trenches for the end walls and for the side walls. You can see it very clearly when I enlarged it up, and you can see the alignments of the walls are in different sections. And I think the section between this sort of purple or reddish coloured section and the one I've coloured in green is reasonably clear. They're not perfectly aligned. They suggest that they are sections of wall which were erected separately. So I'll come back to this point in due course when I'm concluding and sort of think about the implications of this. The only other point that I draw your attention to, since we've got the slide up, is that between those two wall trenches, at this point here, there is a small little post hole, quite unlike the other ones, And I do wonder whether this was actually a setting out post. It was a post that was put in to help align the walls, and there's some evidence for something similar up there as well at these weak corners. It doesn't seem to, certainly not a corner post hole as such. And again, this begins to move us towards the question of how you actually set out a building, how you actually construct a building, a problem I'll come on to at the end. Okay, so let us think what they look like. Well, you've seen the diagram on the left already, and now I can suggest that the walls may have looked something like this. The diagram on the right with sections of wall joined together, with wall plates probably joined together. So that sort of gives you some sense of how these longer buildings, larger buildings, actually worked. Now I want to come on to my second point. My second point is fairly brief, and that is to make it clear that although I've been talking about buildings with common posts, with timber posts, I began by saying that there was not a single tradition, but traditions of building. And I have picked out one tradition, the tradition I believe to be the most important. But I think the value of the waterlogged evidence, the evidence from London, is to make us aware that there were a whole series of different traditions, different types of construction, which were used simultaneously. And the problem has been that on dryland sites, the evidence often doesn't survive for those other traditions. They have simply left no trace in the ground. We cannot say a great deal about them. And I want to pick out one tradition which is clear from a number of sites, a number of waterlogged sites, and that is the use of buildings built of wattle, not built with major posts, but built with wattle. And this type of building is found generally in the north and in the Midlands. There are examples that have been discovered in excavations at Bawtry, at Beverley, at Carlisle, at Durham, and here at Nantwich, as well as at York. And generally, but not always, these have been identified as workshops, so it may be that this sort of building was particularly used for workshops, variously used for salt making, for smithing, for dyeing, or for leatherwork. And we indeed have got historical evidence for this method of building. The first resting place of the body of St Cuthbert at Durham at the end of the 10th century was said to be a church made of wattles, de virgis in Latin. The Lanercost Charter records a chapel built of rods, again de virgis, at Walton in Cumbria during the episcopate of Ethelwulf, so in the 1133 to 1157. Now these of course were not houses. However, Eadmer's account of the miracles of St Oswald, written between 1095 and 1116, recounts how the coffin of the saint prevented the spread of fire through a house made of woven branches. Again, it's wattlework standing in the city of Worcester. So I think there's quite good evidence that although it's not particularly well attested on non-waterlogged sites, there were a number of traditions of buildings, including wattlework. So I think although I'm only talking about a particular type of building, a type which I think is the most common, there are multiple traditions of building operating in England. Well, I want now to come to my third point. My third point is to think about the processes of construction. And one of the problems that we have in reconstructing buildings is to think about how rough the buildings were. Are we to imagine that these were made, as these diagrams indicate, are we to imagine that they were made of badly cut timbers, poorly aligned, poorly set in the ground? I think the evidence that I've suggested to you is no, that is not the case. There were errors of setting out, there were errors of alignment. Indeed, moving around heavy timbers on a building site must have been hard work. But I think that there is very little evidence for any of the techniques which you can see here, including the one which is often invoked by archaeologists, the one on the right, reversed assembly, where they imagine that the beams extend, sometimes cantilevered out beyond the posts, sometimes with the wall plate set inside the post. It's a way of explaining what appear to be inadequately aligned posts. Well, there is very little evidence for that. All the evidence, on the contrary, suggests that, generally speaking, the buildings were well and carefully constructed. So I reject the idea that we are dealing with poorly constructed buildings. And I reject it particularly because, having excavated a number myself, I have seen how carefully the ground was constructed. And I showed you an example at Stenning in Sussex earlier on, and I want to show you another example from Gabble Thomas's excavation at Bishopston, and we went and worked with him and dug part of the wall trench of this particular building. We were digging down here, and here is the wall trench. When we excavated it, it's cut into chalk. Along it would have been set vertical posts, and almost certainly they would have been set hard against that inner edge, the right-hand edge, which is the inner edge, to get a series of effectively perfectly aligned timber posts. And that inner edge was not more or less straight, it was absolutely straight. It had clearly not been cut casually, it had been cut absolutely with care. And where we have got hard geology, where they can get a hard, sharp edge, as in the green sand at Stenning or the chalk here at Bishopston, we can often show very considerable care is used in the construction and laying out of these buildings to get those absolutely straight alignment for the timbers so that you can put a wall plate on top of them. So I think there is clear evidence that not only is the ground being used very carefully, but the timbers and the structure above it is also carefully constructed. Now, I want finally to come on to this example, and I owe my thoughts, or at least my fact that I had to think about it, to Adam McBride, who was one of the excavators of the site of Long Wittenham in Oxfordshire, and it's only possible to reinterpret it because of the skill with which this building was excavated and the evidence which the excavators recovered. And I want to suggest that, in fact, we can go some way in thinking about the sequence of construction, which illuminates and ties together many of the features which I've talked about. Well, here quite clearly is a building with trench construction, and at places, but not along the whole length, we can see evidence of those post ghosts where the timbers actually were, but where they have rotted. We can see quite clearly that there was entrance on the lower side, the south side of the building, where there's a gap in the wall trench. But we can also say something about the sequence of construction, because in this particular case, they started off by putting in the corner posts. Now, these are not clearly weak corners, but they are treating the corners in a different way. And we can say that these were the first things to go in, because there you have got it. You've got the wall trenches actually cutting the fill of the post holes at the corner. So the post holes in the corner were set in, they were put in position, the post holes were cut, the timbers were set in position, not a single post, but in fact a pair, or at an angle, an L-shaped arrangement of timbers set in there. And that was backfilled to secure those timbers in position, and then they set out to build the building. And one must presume, although the evidence isn't clear, that they did probably the same in the other three corners. So we've got a building which they start off by setting out the corners, presumably because it helps them actually control the alignment of the walls and probably the height of the wall plates, because you can, once you've got posts up at the corner, you can put strings in, make sure the top of the posts are all level. And the next thing that they seem to have done is to dig the wall trench for the end wall, and to dig the wall trench for the eastern half of the building. And you can see quite clearly that the eastern half of the building is a break in the north or top side here, upper side here, because they stopped work at that stage, and they apparently constructed, first of all, the eastern or right-hand half of the building, and then they put the timbers in. They would have packed them around. They may well have joined up those walls with beams running across the building, and perhaps even put the rafters on it. Because once you have got your beams connecting your two walls, you've got a good solid structure. And at that point, they seem to have then proceeded with the western half of the building, and at that point, they got themselves into difficulties. Now, people who study buildings are always slightly reluctant to invoke builder error as an explanation. It's an easy way out, but I think in this case it is the most likely way out, because you can see that when they cut the trench up here, they set it slightly off. They didn't set it in alignment. Now, the easiest thing in the world would have been to put a string on the ground and to cut a single trench right the way along. Why didn't they do it? I suspect they didn't do it because it was easier to put this half of the building up and then cut the trench there, because it made movement around the building when you're putting up the first half much easier. You haven't got to step over a trench, and if you're carrying large heavy timbers, you don't want to. So you put up the first half, you then cut the trenches for the second half, and they made an error in setting it out, and it ended up, I suspect, by accident rather than design, as having a kink in it. And it became an angle-sided building, not, I think, by intention, but rather by error, because it is not a typical angle-sided building. And in fact, you can see, if we look at the trenches in the there and there, you can see they have got a quite clear kink, again implying to my mind that we are dealing with sections of walling which are being put up. And we can suggest, therefore, that in fact those walls on the long side of the building were probably put up in fairly small sections with the timbers set in place, and then a wall plate put on top of them, possibly then linked across the width of the building with a beam, a tie beam, and then the next section put up, and so on. And in that way, the building was constructed. Well, what I've tried to do is to outline the very broad picture of what we can get. And I think that there is, I've avoided the word tradition, I've said we've got traditions of building, but I think we have one clear dominant tradition of using common posts set in posts and post holes, and I think that this is a long-running tradition, although there clearly are differences between buildings of the 5th and the 12th century. We should not expect that building techniques stay the same, but I think there are fundamental similarities. I've suggested that by carefully looking through and thinking through the implications of the evidence, it is possible to think about the processes of construction and think about what these buildings might have been like. So although our evidence often stops below ground level, we can have a fairly good chance at interpreting and talking about, with reasonable confidence, the nature of buildings from the early Middle Ages. Thank you.